Scaling is a key consideration of systems change because the ultimate aim of systems change is to change a system, and systems are normally quite large, complex things. So how are we going to get um, from some initial innovation, some initial intervention, to actually changing the whole system? That is a challenge indeed. Our world is full of many small initiatives that have not realized their full impact to actually change, or their full potential to really change systems in the way that's needed in response to the kind of scale and complexity of the challenges we face today. Many of the current approaches are linear in their thinking and assumptions, um, which is not really what's needed in a world of radical and kind of exponential change and transformation. So this guide is here to help us think about how to do that sort of transformational kind of change instead of the incremental change. We can call it non-linear. So it's really key idea here is that we're scaling patterns of organization rather than growing things or products, more services, bigger organizations, so on and so forth. We're more trying to scale a new way of doing things, a new way of organizing the system, a new pattern, and so on. So this is an interesting quote here. Very often scale is looked at as scaling an organization or enterprise as opposed to scaling a concept. Looking beyond scaling a particular organization requires a major mindset shift. We must determine how can we collaboratively scale action around a particular problem through the engagement of all the stakeholders affected by the issue. Only then will we make meaningful change in how complex social problems are addressed. So it's getting to this idea that we're not trying to, do more of the same. We're not trying to produce more products or grow our organization. We know that one organization, one intervention, solution, program, this can't really change a system. What's needed is that we actually activate different parts of that system, or even the whole system, in new ways. And what's really needed is the growth of new patterns of organization, new ways of doing things, and ultimately the emergence of new outcomes in the system. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about systems innovation. How do we grow a new pattern in the system and scale that? Because the traditional approach, scaling, is tries to find something that works and inject resources into it to duplicate this operation and scale its production. We see this is the traditional conception, right? When we find a product or a startup or something like this that works, we just put more resources into it to try and duplicate it. But that's not what systems innovation is about. It's about scaling networks and the capacities. Scaling systems innovation requires us to ask, how can we scale the outcomes, not by growing one organization or program, but by connecting it with others so that together they can form a new, more functional system. But how can we unlock more resources across the system instead of just growing our organization? And this requires us to create new networks, new ways of connecting, new protocols, and so forth. So systems change is a lot about unlocking the collective genius of everyone. That is why systems changing innovations are best looked at as movements. Movements start with stories and culture that bring people together, that bring actors together within a new paradigm, a new set of values. When scaling an ecosystem by creating connections, we do not need to create the connections ourselves. We just need to create the right conditions for others to start connecting. So that's the kind of core insight, that it's this non-linear approach we'll talk about in a minute, but it's about patterns of organization. We're trying to regenerate the system. That's what we're trying to do with systems change. And we do that through creating a new pattern of organization, new dynamic in the system. And it's a lot to do with emergence. If you're familiar with this term, we're trying to get the emergence of a new way of doing things in the system. So Margaret Wheatley, as I pointed to earlier, wrote a really interesting article where she talks about emergence as the way to scale systems innovation. When separate local effects connect with each other as networks, then strengthen as communities of practice, suddenly and surprisingly, a new system emerges at a greater level of scale. This system of influence possesses qualities and capabilities that were unknown in the individuals. It isn't that they were hidden. So she's talking about the idea of emergence here, very big idea in systems thinking. And it's really what we're trying to achieve when we talk about systems change, the emergence of a new pattern of organization that is quite radically different from what was there before. It isn't that they were hidden, they simply don't exist until the system emerges. They are properties of the system, not the individual, but once there, individuals possess them. And the system that emerges always possesses greater power and influence than is possible through planned incremental change. Emergence is how life creates radical change and takes things to scale. So hopefully you keep that idea of emergence in mind as you go through here. It's really a core concept. Once you grasp the idea of emergence, you'll really grasp the ideas of what we're trying to do in systems change and systems innovation. But this is one way of looking at it, one way of seeing that differentiation between a more traditional kind of linear approach to growth and scaling and a nonlinear approach. The linear approach is a lot of how we do things, particularly in the public sector and non-for-profits and so forth. It's kind of centralized organization, has some solution or program or plan or whatever it is, and they're trying to grow that. It's planned, right? We try to predict what's going to happen in the future, and we say we're going to reach these targets by this time, and those targets by that in a few years down the line. So it's planned out, it's incremental in some sense, it's professionally generated, right? The people in the organizations are the professionals who are producing the solution and pushing it out to others. It's working with the parts, kind of mass-produced approach, permissioned, and it's a kind of an artificial form of growth, actually. There's a lot of kind of pushing. It always takes more resources and energy inputted into the organization to create more growth. And actually, a non-linear approach is very different. It's the approach we're talking about here, the approach of growing new patterns in the system. It's decentralized in the sense that it's not one organization that's trying to grow. It's the activation of different parts across the system that we're trying to bring into a new way of coordination so that they can work together to realize the emergence of new functions in the system. It's potentially exponential because it's a network and non-linear. It's emergent, user-generated. Right? It's actually the parts in the system that we're trying to activate, the users or the other organizations rather than ourselves. It's working with connections rather than producing more things. And it's about network effects. We'll talk about those. It's permissionless. And it's an organic sort of growth, as Margaret Wheatley was alluding to there. Emergence in these networks are how nature and ecosystems grow and develop and take things to scale. So we'll look at some examples of that now in a minute. Anybody have any questions actually at this time on these topics? You can unmute yourself if you want. Are we all on the same page here? Can we speak more about permission? Yeah. So there's permission versus permissionless. So permission, this here is really the normal organization that you would know about. And in most organizations, you've got to have permission to do things, right? If you want to set up anything, then you probably need to get money from your boss and you need permission to do it and so forth. Whereas here, it's not like that. If we think about something like a peer-to-peer file sharing system, you don't really need permission. You can just join that. The example we're going to talk about here, actually a really good example, is the internet. And if we think about that, you don't really need permission to join the internet. You can just join. You can set up a computer and connect to the internet. Whereas over here, if you're part of Microsoft or whatever, well, then you need permission from your boss to go and set up new data centers and so forth. Does this characterization, this kind of representation here make sense to everyone? This linear versus non-linear? Okay, we'll stay going. So the linear strategy, just to kind of zoom in on that a bit more, a closed linear strategy to scaling is one where we know well from our existing, we know this already. Traditionally, we approach the scaling issue by simply producing more. That is to say, creating some viable product and then duplicating that and scaling out in that way. We create a solution or a program ourselves within a closed organization and then scale through producing more of it. And yeah, this is the planning kind of approach. In this respect, the model used by many organizations is one of discovery, proof of concepts, and do piloting. And if they work, then they scale that and duplicate that solution. Okay, and that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about this nonlinear approach, which is all about networks. Here, scaling systems change is not about numbers, but about changing the system structure. So in the end, we're trying to change the paradigm, the whole way that this system works. And that doesn't come through producing more of something or increasing one of the parts. It comes from changing the structure, the way the thing's organized. Thus, instead of creating more organization projects or pilots, we're looking at the protocols and interrelationship of existing solutions. Connections create the potential for nonlinear paradigm shifts. So it's all about connecting across the system in new ways and creating new networks. And I gave that example of the internet, and I think it's a very good illustration of this. The internet is probably the most scalable thing that's kind of almost ever existed on or the speed with which it's grown. It was growing at about 1 million users added to the internet every day up until recently. And what is the internet? The internet is just a network, a protocol for our computers to connect and come into a similar system of organization through which we can exchange and start to work together. And that's very different to how an organization like Amazon might grow. Right? So Amazon is a closed organization. And as they grow, they stay adding servers and adding servers, buying more servers and so forth, and getting bigger and bigger, doing more of the same or slight changes within that. Here, the internet is all about connecting across all of us. And it's a very organic way because it's actually driven by us, right? It's driven by the users in the system. We're choosing to connect into that system. And companies are choosing to set up servers and so forth. So this is a very different paradigm or a very different way of growing and scaling. And it's the kind that we're talking about. It's also a very organic one. And it turns out to be very kind of messy also, right? You get these very complicated networks or complex networks as opposed to this, which is kind of controlled and so forth. But it's extremely scalable. Right? There are no limits to the scale of the internet at this stage because it's creating itself, right? It's almost endogenously created. So that's that. And getting back to this idea of emergence from Margaret Wheatley, because that's what it is. The internet has emerged, right? No one really planned the internet. No one really predicted it. No one's really in control of the development of the internet. We've all, again, it's permissionless, as I said. Anyone on the planet can choose to connect into the internet. And that is, the internet has emerged as a new phenomenon on our planet. It's a new system of organization, extremely scalable, like incredible speed that it scales. So here's Margaret Wheatley talking about emergence again. Emergence is the fundamental scientific explanation of how local changes can materialize as global systems of influence. As a change theory, it offers methods and practices to accomplish the system-wide changes that are so needed at this time. As leaders and communities of connected people, we need to intentionally work with emergence so that our efforts will result in truly hopeful futures. No matter what other change strategies we have learned or favored, emergence is the only way change really happens on this planet, and that's good news. So she gives an account or model in some way of how those small dispersed communities develop and become systems of influence. It's part of the kind of two loops model, but she says initially there are these dispersed communities who know not much about each other, and then they get together to exchange amongst themselves, initially for their own benefit, really. And they're these kind of dispersed networks. But over time, if they develop and grow, she says they can become communities of practice, and communities of practice can ultimately develop into a system of influence over time. So she has a certain model about the formation, emergence, and development of movements and systems changing movements, I should say. Movements is kind of the best way to describe a systems change, because it's happening, it needs to happen in a decentralized way across the system. So in a nonlinear approach to change, emergence is the key consideration. The question becomes not how do we scale out and replicate a particular solution, but how do we create the conditions for emergence of a new system? How do the small, local initiatives that contain the seeds of the new link together to realize the emergence of a new overall pattern? And Margaret Wheatley with the Buchanan Institute recognizes 3 stages, as I was mentioning, to scaling systems change to emergence. The aim is to start with a small group of people who form what we call a creative integrity. They're willing to stand for something, sustain involvement and energy for its growth, to build a self-reinforcing network. These networks are essential for people finding like-minded others, the first stage of the life cycle of emergence. So we'll talk more about this further down the line. We'll look at we have a bit of a model over here that we'll look at. She's talking about these initial people, how they congregate, they create a story around what they're doing, they attract others, and so forth. So just to finish that thought, these informed networks can be fostered to become communities of practice where over time the focus extends beyond the needs of the group. The third stage is the sudden appearance of the network that has real power and influence. Pioneering efforts that fluttered at the periphery rapidly become the new norm. The patterns sustained by small fringe communities now become the new normal. And they give the example of the rise of alternative technologies. When back in the 60s, it was very much a fringe thing, and then people got together, and over time, it's now becoming a system of influence. Does that make sense? Any questions on what I covered there? This idea of emergence, okay. Brenda, do you want to unmute yourself and tell us your thoughts?
Well, I can unmute, but I'm not sure I have the answer. So I was looking for advice because I just find people there's so many linear thinkers in the world, and usually they're the ones who have control and power. And I think the system thinkers seem to be more lateral and willing to work with messy. So I tried to find those people to work with, but I'm just wondering if you or any others have any other advice.
Yeah, I think there's a good reason why the people in power adopt linear approaches. It's because they are in power and they actually have the capacity to kind of do those linear things, don't they, right? If you're the president or the CEO, you have millions of dollars or billions of dollars and you can make things happen, whereas it's those people kind of on the fringes who don't have that, who need to be more creative, right, in their thinking. I mean, that's one thing that I observe, yeah. Okay, Eva, did you want to share something?
Yes, I think that also decision makers sometimes don't know all the variables. They don't want to be responsible to really say that they're going to analyze all the variables. So I think a way would be to help them figure out like all those systems that they have to analyze in order to make policy proposals or other ideas, no, like to show them what they need to understand and to analyze in their own context. That's one idea of what I've been thinking and working on.
Yeah, but I think it's also, it requires a paradigm shift in their thinking. So you do need to try and make that happen, you know, shifting to how can they create the context, right, for new things to emerge instead of looking for the solution. Quite often we're looking for a solution, aren't we? And move away from that in terms of how could we create the context within which new things might emerge and create those connections, and we get emergence, you know. So I think it does take a certain, like a lot of people aren't thinking like that, policymakers and so forth, are they? So I think there's a lot to be done in terms of just changing that thinking, and then, you know, new approaches could come from that. Okay, so a key aspect here is this idea of kind of feedback loops and network effects. And we talked about like this is an organic form of growth or an endogenous form of growth. We can see here, this here by Amazon, this isn't endogenous, it's actually planned, and it takes a lot of energy to keep on building their systems and so forth, and predicted and controlled and so forth. The internet here was an endogenous organic thing. It created itself. And it creates itself. These networks create themselves and they grow and they scale, and they can sometimes grow incredibly fast, much faster than this, through these network effects, right? The internet, as mentioned, has grown incredibly fast. And that's through feedback loops. And this idea of the network effect is that when more people join a pattern of organization, that makes it more attractive for other people to join. So the more people that speak English, the more attractive it is for you to speak English, the more valuable it is to speak English. So this can form, once it gains traction, a very powerful mechanism, because it's got a feedback. The more that join, the more that want to join. And that's the way the internet has grown. In the beginning, it wasn't very valuable. There weren't that many people there. And now it's very valuable because there's a lot of people on the internet. And that's the endogenous way the system's growing, building itself. And that's that. It's about protocols, as we can see. It's ways this system is going to organize and start to work together. And quite often that's simple rules. It doesn't require very complicated rules. The HTTP protocol by Tim Berners-Lee is actually quite simple, but it allows our computers to communicate with each other. And that's allowed us to do all sorts of amazing things. And it means that it's also created a lot of value, and we all know it creates a lot of value. It enables us to communicate and exchange, and that's why it gets that feedback loop. So that's an example of a very powerful scaling mechanism through protocols that connect things in the system. We get feedback loops, and there's quite simple rules to it. Again, you can find all of this in the guides. You can read it down there below afterwards. So this is kind of getting to the scaling process that Margaret Wheatley is talking about. Going from kind of a new story in the system, or a new narrative, a culture that enables people to come together and recognize each other and start to work together, to start to form a community around that. And then ultimately start to harness resources, new resources in the system, and in the end become an institution. So we're going to work down here on thinking about that in the context of, let's take systems change in the context of transport. How can we move from a car-dependent city to a biking city where people are cycling around? And I maybe want you guys to start posting up ideas here up at the top around the story that we might create to attract people. And then we'll start jumping into some of the slides to talk about that. So let's take a few minutes to do that, and then we'll come back. I just want to post them here in this section. Around what's the story we'd start to create to try and shift people from a car-dependent city or mode of transport to a cycling. So yeah, how are we going to bring people together? I'll talk more about this now in a minute, but we need an initial narrative, initial story around what we're doing and the value and importance of it to start to attract people. And I wanted you just to try that to get us started. What are the values we need to put into this? Yeah, please put them on the stickies up on the mirror board. Again, we're trying to create a movement here. Right? Imagine our city, like most cities, is dominated by cars. And we want to try and create a movement like they've done in the Netherlands to some extent, where everyone's, or most people, the dominant mode is cycling. Yes, Eva, we're just working on the first one here. What's the story we're going to tell to create this movement? What would we even call this movement, right? That would be part of it, wouldn't it? It'd be the cycling movement or something like this. Cycle movement. Sports make you healthier. That we can make our city more livable. I mean, there's many cars have many detrimental effects to city life: pollution, lack of movement, in general, the amount of space they take. So this could be about taking back our public space. In some cities like Paris, I think it's 50% of the public space is given over to cars. So yeah, the Netherlands actually used to be a car-dominated country in the 1960s. It was after that they actually managed to change in a quite radical way to bicycles. And you go to Amsterdam now, it's the dominant mode of transport. And there are people championing that. There are movements championing them. So, okay, let's just take a little look up here. We'll talk a little bit about stories. So this is what we're talking about in terms of scaling a movement, really. Changing a system is really about bringing people together, changing their mindsets, and connecting new parts of that system to create that kind of a movement. And as mentioned, it starts with a story and culture. Right? If we look at most new innovations, they start with people who are dedicated and committed, as Margaret Wheatley was saying, because it takes a big investment of time and energy. These transformations, these paradigm shifts are nonlinear processes of change, and that means that it takes a big investment at the beginning, and it's often quite slow. Like the internet started all the way back in the 1960s. Wasn't until the 1990s that myself and you and everyone else started to get interested in it. So it takes a lot of committed and passionate people to actually make these things happen, which is the case of the internet. There were many people who contributed a lot of time and energy to building the internet before we all jumped on it, and there was a lot of money there and so forth. So that's because it's nonlinear. At the beginning, it takes a big investment, and it's not very valuable to be part of it for most people. And it's not until it hits the takeoff curve that it becomes more valuable than it costs us to be involved. So we're all now prepared to pay our 20, 30 euros a month to get internet access, because it's worth vastly more to us than that. But at the beginning, that's not the case. So it takes people who believe in this, right? And that requires a culture of some kind of story about why this is of value and its importance and significance. And we need to communicate that to others to attract others. But over time, we can hopefully get a community built around this, right? And let's just take a look at some of these boards here. So this is the culture aspect and building a story, a shared language. To turn a random group of people into something more, we need to create a culture that forms the first iteration in forming a context for connecting people and scaling a movement. We may find people who care about seeing changes in the system, but they may not recognize each other or see their commonality at the beginning. So going back to Margaret Wheatley and her example of the movement for alternative energy, or the development of alternative energy. In the beginning, the people who are experimenting with hydro, and those who are experimenting with wind, and others with solar and so forth, they didn't really see themselves as part of a common system that we do now as a whole alternative energy system. These people may well be inarticulate about what they care about, and when communicating may well speak different languages, apparently not having much in common. To turn this random collection of people into a movement, we'll have to create a shared language and culture that will enable them to articulate a shared intent. The culture should work to start to break the boundaries down between people and let them start to operate as a coherent group and communicate to others what they're doing and why it's important. So we talked about stories in a previous learning session. Yeah, we have canvases and guides on how to go about constructing stories. We need to build a world, world building, talk about values, identity, direction, and so forth. I'm not going to go into all of that today, but it's key to building any sort of movement or community, which is the next stage where we're going to collect people. And once we have a collection of people, they start to have dynamics. We have a social dynamic going on now. Initially, it was all just ideas. Ideas expressed through stories can only go so far. To start to strengthen and scale further the pattern, we have to engage people differently on different levels as social creatures. When we add sociability, we start to get a community and a movement. As Charles Lieberbeter notes, this is when innovation really takes off, when it becomes a movement. When you get this movement of ideas, technology, organization, and culture, which leads to a kind of momentum, that creates its own kind of scale and finds its own flow of resources to push it forwards. So it's about activating a group of people and creating a tribe around what you're doing, what you're trying to grow, what you're trying to scale. And this could take systems innovation. We could be trying to change any kind of system. This could be a movement for regenerative agriculture. It could be bicycles, as we're talking about. It could be, the internet and computing or whatever it is. To make it happen on a large scale as a systems innovation, we're going to have to activate other people across the system, have a shared story, connect them, and start to build the connections, start to build a tribe around this. Creating tribes and communities that form a movement is key to scaling systems innovation. A tribe is a group of people connected in some way and share an identity, a way of being and acting. Harley Davidson motorbikes, cyclists are part of a tribe. They have not only a shared culture, but also a set of socially recognizable signs and symbols for them to signal their identity and value to others. So that's what a social group is what we're talking about there, building a community, what you're trying to grow and change. And after that, we need to talk about resource flows. How are we going to harness the resources needed for this? Let's go back here on our mirror board. So we started this movement for cycling here with a bit of a story around why this is important, and the value of it really is what we're getting at here. Sports make you healthier. Cycling is joyful and fun. Young people inclusion. Desire a better quality of life, less pollution, integrated mobility, family friendly, less carbon, fewer cars, more trees, less heat islands. Yep. Great. So over here, we want to think about this thing of creating tribe. How are we going to create a social group around this, an identity? How do people connect? How do we network effect? How would we get network effects going to actually grow this tribe? If we just started out, if we're living in Detroit or somewhere where everyone drives their car, how are we really going to get this movement for cycling bikes going? We're the only people here at the moment. We have a story about why it's important. How are we going to start to connect people and get them involved and get these network effects going and create an identity for ourselves? And get them sharing, right? That's part of what we're trying to do here. They're part of this movement. They're creating this movement. So how can we get them to share this great idea and this great practice? Let's post some ideas up there. Going back to the Harley Davidson thing, they're signaling to other people. That's what communities do. People are part of a community, have an identity. They represent that identity and they share it with others because they believe in it. So the Harley Davidson, they all wear their jackets and they drive their motorbikes. What do we do here in our movement for cycling in Detroit? Yeah, that's a good question. Noah is saying, do you want to unmute yourself and say that?
Yeah, I'm just noticing when you're talking about values in a tribe, tribal values often define themselves in opposition to other tribes. So bicyclists are special because they're not Harley Davidson riders. How do we get around that? Because it seems like it creates closed linear organizations.
Yeah, I think just having a principle of inclusivity, but being aware of it, isn't it? And saying we're not building our community based on exclusivity, based on, a hierarchy that we're better than others. I know it's part of, this is what we've done with our community. I don't know how familiar you are with the systems innovation community, but we're about 7,000 members now. We've been growing over the past number of years, and we've thought about this as we've gone along, like intentionally, how do we make this inclusive to other people and make sure we're not excluding people and so forth. So I think it's that intentionality that's important, yeah. And defining yourself, I think you got to define yourself by something that you create and is positive, not by the exclusion of another. I think is a good principle also. Okay, let's see what we've got here. Free community events like Cyclavia, I like that. That's good. Create pathways. So that's going to be places where people get together. I think that's going to be an important part of this, isn't it? Because you're building a social network. We want to create spaces for people to get together. And that's also going to amplify it, self-amplify it. When people get together, that's shared and seen by other people. Create pathways that show where bikes can go. Culture of decoding bikes and sharing our own decorating bikes and sharing our own style. Yeah, we could create some kind of a bike theme, couldn't we? Which is communicating that we're part of this movement for bikes. Yeah, having green bikes or something like this, or a little sign on your bike that says, that has cycle movement on it, or something like this, that's showing other people you're part of this movement. And then you're giving out free signs to people also for them to be part of the movement and share that. A culture, so we've done that, have a culture of helping, i.e. for people who have bike breakdowns and help each other, helping lone riders to find enthusiasts to ride alongside with, placemaking to connect with others, find places where it would greatly help to have bike lanes and create it temporarily at first and inhabit it. Walking, bike tours of favorite sports around town, use apps to engage people, address their problems, show the challenges of why people are not wearing bikes in different places, create events, fun rides with many people during certain days. Yeah, I think events are going to be a big part of this because you're trying to bring people together to form, cultivate, and develop their shared identity as part of this and promote it to other people. That's ideally what you're trying to get to. A culture of positive identifiers like helmet hair. Yeah. Education, why is it change? Why is change necessary and how will it work? And how can people be key contributors to the process? Demonstrate that the bike can be a fun and useful tool for the intended shift. I think education is actually part of this over here, because all of this here, the story is the ideas around this. This here is the bit where we get people involved and we're harnessing that as the engine for driving. Over here, the engine is the idea, sharing the ideas and the value of this. Here, the engine is that people are going to drive this forward for us by connecting with other people and sharing it. Okay, so we just have 10 minutes, so I'm going to stay going for the sake of time. The next stage is around how do we actually harness resources? If this is really going to grow, if it's going to develop, it can only survive so long on fresh air and no money. At some stage, it's going to need some resources. So we need to think about how to attract those resources. Change starts at the fringes and grows to become central over time. At the start of the movement, it will be all ideas and no resources. As we start to connect people and build a community, the emphasis will shift from ideas and people towards mobilizing resources. After time, we'll get people involved in this, and they'll start to want to form some kind of organization, and they'll need resources to do that. Over time, a community will want to see real change in the world. These impacts will require change in the flows of resources and development of capability. At the early stages of scaling processes, it's unlikely that the community will have many resources. We want to change physical flows by creating new connections that link together underutilized capacity in the existing system. So this is about how do we start to create new flows and attract new resources towards what we're doing and repurpose existing resources towards new ends. In systems change, we're introducing new ideas and new values into the system, and that's going to result in new value flows, new resource flows in the system. So here we need to ask, how can we attract those resources into this new pattern that we're that we're building here, and at this stage, what an interesting thing comes to play, that's extrinsic motivation. Beforehand, it was all kind of intrinsic motivation, particularly here. These people at the beginning, they were very intrinsically motivated, and a lot of these. But now, when we're starting to repurpose resources, this is a different kind of scaling engine. This can be about money and resources and so forth, and value, extrinsic motivators. So it's a different kind of scaling engine. So let's think about that down here. How are we going to track the resources? Maybe we need to set up an organization, some centralized component here to really make this this new movement happen, and they need some money to do that and so forth. So how would we get those resources? What would we be repurposing in the system to have these resources flow in this new direction? Maybe it's something to do with those resources that were previously utilized by car transportation could in some way be repurposed. You can see the questions down here. What new resources do we need to mobilize? What exists that could be repurposed? What new value exchanges do we need to create? So we've seen, I'm not sure if they have them in your city, but in many cities now, they have these on-demand bike rental systems that didn't really exist before, public services, public transport. You could have things, we could be creating a platform for bike sharing and things around fixing bikes and repairing bikes and creating bikes. There could be, we could be creating a platform for bike makers and bike fixers who are charging other people and people are paying for those services. Now we have money moving around and we have resources. Okay, let's take a look at some of these. So city and council government grants, bike projects. Yeah, public money shifts from car infrastructure to bike infrastructure. So there's a lot of money here in this system, the transport system for a city. How can we repurpose that, move it away from cars and towards bicycles here? So we're going to have to think creatively about that. And there's a lot of incentives start to take effect now, right? There's people who are going to have vested interests in keeping motorways, building motorways and cars and so forth. So how are we going to get innovative and creative around repurposing and attracting the new resources to this system? So creating parking fees to develop the projects at first. Yep. Individuals sell cars and buy bikes, health system money invested in safe cycling. Yeah, for healthier systems. Yeah, you see, when you start to think about this, there's lots of places we could tap into revenue sources to help grow this. Funding from international interests in greener transport against climate change, create discounts in places where people go to certain places. Public transport allow bikes, no train and buses, give support to those who can least afford a bike, make sure people's environments are safe for riding. Okay. Promote the use of people who has bikes already. Repurpose. So this one, promote the use of people who have bikes already. That might actually be up here, I'd say, maybe in this section. I'm not sure. It's not really to do with resource flows. Repurpose large parking lots for more dense development. Yes, okay. Take taxes from gas and oil to support more dense development. Yeah, there's many different opportunities. So the point of this is that now we have a new scaling engine, which is incentives, right? So people are going to start to join this now because of the money involved. So let's take a look here and think about the internet, because I think this also reflects the internet. The early days of the internet were all about multimedia and us exchanging information and images and so on and so forth. It was a lot to do with culture and information. Over time, social networks came to dominate the internet. And a little bit further along, Uber and Airbnb and all of these came along, and a lot of us started to get involved in the internet as money-making ways, right? Driving for Uber or Airbnb and so forth. And so I think this is somewhat reflective of how the internet has grown. Here, the community thing, we all started to get engaged in social networks and so forth. That's a lot of why we went online. So that's what I'm talking about. You're now here, back here, there wasn't much money in the internet. It was very difficult to make money on the internet. Now there's all sorts of opportunities. There's billions of dollars flowing through big platforms. And it becomes a serious business at this stage. And that thing is attracting, that's why a lot of us are getting involved in the internet for money exchanges and so forth, e-commerce and so forth. So that's that. The final stage is an interesting one, because if this systems change, which started as a little thing on the fringes, rebelling against the system, is going to be a systems change. It's going to have to become the system. It's going to become an institution. It's going to become the dominant way of doing things. An institution is the default way that people do things within a system. And that's ultimately what's needed, and it's going to need a lot of technology to support that, to make it the default way. So that's, I would say, the final stage. It's what Margaret Wheatley was talking about when she said a system of influence, when it becomes extremely dominant and the primary way that we actually get things done. So down here, we've put in technology as a way of kind of supporting the scaling. It's another way of scaling, right, using technology. Maybe you want to put in some ideas there quickly before we wrap up. We've actually kind of touched upon a few, right? Those bike shares that are enabled by web applications and web platforms, e-scooters and so forth. If this, for an organization, a new pattern to grow and scale to a systems level these days, it's going to require a lot of technology to support it. That's what we're talking about here. Okay, so I think we'll have to leave it here. Hopefully you got the idea there that technology is actually another way of scaling things. So we've been talking about scaling systems change. We're going to wrap up now because our time is up. Really fascinating subject. Actually, there's a lot of confusion around it. I think this is really core of it, understanding this difference between linear and non-linear, and that the linear traditional approach is about growing a solution by duplicating it and enlarging it, whether that's an organization or whether that's a product or whatever it is. It's the mass production industrial age mode. What we're talking about here, a non-linear way and a systems change innovation, is actually going to have to reorganize that system, and that means creating a new pattern of organization, a new way of connecting across that system, and of course changing the paradigm, changing the thinking in the system. So that's what we're trying to grow. We're trying to grow a new network. At the beginning, it's a small little thing. It's just a few people. But over time, if we are fortunate, if we nurture and develop and invest in it, it'll go from being just the committed people with a little story about the importance of what they're doing to a larger community, to harnessing resources, to ultimately becoming an institution and reshaping that system. And that systems change, systems innovation, and how to think about scaling it and growing it. I hope that was helpful for all of you. As mentioned, you'll find the guide there on the website. It goes more in depth in it. It also, at the end, it has resources that you can dig into, and I recommend this one, really interesting article. Margaret Wheatley, she talks more about the emergence kind of dimension to it. This is our next event coming up in a month from now. We'll kind of continue on this discussion, but it's more about impact, investment, and assessment for systems innovation. You can find the link there. Hope to see you all then. Our social channels are here. If you want to join, we'll keep you posted. The video will be on YouTube here. And I'm going to wrap up there. If you want to leave a little bit of feedback, that would be welcome. Just grab a sticky and place it on the slider here according to the question. You can find it there. Okay, everybody, thank you very much for joining, and I hope to see you again next month.